In a recent speech, President Biden directly referenced a glaring weakness in his reelection campaign, which is the gaping disconnect between the facts of his administration's accomplishments and the more important feelings of the American people. But before we unpack all that, if you haven't yet, please hit that like, subscribe, and the alert bell. Okay, so President Biden, we got a couple of clips here, and the second one is pretty long. But President Biden recently gave a speech at the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, and he directly referenced what I believe is the single greatest weakness of his reelection campaign.
Median household wealth has grown by 37% in real terms since before the pandemic. I acknowledge there's a disconnect between the numbers and how people feel about their place in the world right now. We can deal with the second part as well.
I'm not going to play the rest. That's it. That's important right there, that he directly referenced that he is aware of that disconnect and he plans to address it because it's huge. It is the single thing, or I should say the single biggest thing, which is undermining his popularity, in my opinion. Now, that leads us to the second clip here. So there's an author who's writing a book about basically messaging to save democracy. And I just wanted to play a quick introduction to him and his book. And then at the very end, he gives like a really incisive 2-minute observation about the state of political messaging. And I say it's incisive because I too have made a similar message repeatedly over multiple videos in the past year. But this is the author in question, and then we'll play that third clip.
Author and MSNBC political analyst Anand Giridharadas. His recent book, The Persuaders, at the front lines of the fight for hearts, minds, and democracy.
I have not read that book yet, but you can damn well be certain that I shall. So Anand Giridharadas, he's being interviewed on MSNBC by Morning Joe, and this is the big part. This is like the most important of the clips. Okay, this is his observation, and I hope that every Democratic politician and their surrogate, and you and I, people who support the Democratic Party and the progressive left in general over the regressive right and the Republican Party, take this to heart.
That's so on point for me, and I want to reframe it slightly, because here's the puzzle. You are right that they are running on not governing and not helping people and not doing things for people. They are running on elections not being valid things that need to be respected. They're running on fascism in many cases. But here's the puzzle. When you take it to the American people, those set of ideas are actually running neck and neck against governing and honoring elections and, not fascism. So it's not just 10 guys or 100 guys who we can be outraged about. That somehow this movement, many of our fellow citizens, may not be a majority, but tens of millions of our fellow citizens are looking at this. Maybe they're exhausted.
By the way, 77 million in 2020.
Correct. So I think that, to me, it's so easy to get outraged about the 100 people or whatever, but there's a problem out there among us, right? And I would, going back to the earlier conversation about attention noise, I would summarize it as you have one party that's basically all story and no governing at this point. But I think the inverse is also true. They are up against, on the Democratic side, all governing and no story. And I don't think you can only blame the Republicans for this. I think at the end of the day, it's true of Biden. I think it's true of movements, grassroots movements. This is the conversation I hear inside these spaces. There's way too much of a kind of faith that if you just do the right things for people and do the right policies and the numbers are good, Bidenomics, this, that people will reward you. And I'm sorry, all of us who actually work in the story business, whether it's in movements or TV or whatever, we all know that nothing speaks for itself actually in life. You have to tell a story to go with what you're doing for people. And I think in many ways, Democrats are leaving space for the MTGs and other idiots of the world by failing to narrate this moment, failing to offer a compelling vision of America that is thrilling and galvanizing and exciting. It starts with the president, but it goes all the way down. And I think that vacuum has to be filled.
Nothing speaks for itself. 100%. And listen, I almost want to take a minute because that guy basically brought me to church, right? He's absolutely 100% correct in my estimation. Facts do not, never have, and never will speak for themselves. Again, I joke, I make fun of Ben Shapiro all the time where he's like, facts don't care about your feelings, gang. Maybe in the sense that facts are unchanged by feelings, but in a democracy, in politics, feelings matter infinitely more than facts, which is part of the reason why the Republican Party has been, relatively speaking, so successful over the decades, despite the fact that they are fewer in number, despite the fact that their record is terrible in comparison to Democratic politicians, Democratic governance. They have better story, they have better messaging discipline, and the media grades them on a curve. And I also believe, not to say that there's been a complete absence of story, a complete absence of narrative, but a relative lack of one. And it just, so many Democrats kind of like just give off this energy that, listen, just facts will speak for themselves and you shouldn't bother trying to shape or reshape public perception. I completely disagree. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. But let's try it, because we've tried the other way with mixed results. So perhaps we should try a different way, okay? And what's interesting is the New York Times had this like expose talking about voters who supported, believe it or not, who are very enthusiastic about Vice President Kamala Harris, but either opposed to President Biden or just lukewarm on him. And this particular passage stood out to me when it was brought to my attention. Yet in some ways, Ms. Carrillo Hinojosa is the kind of voter that Mr. Biden hopes he can win once people start focusing on the race. Mr. Trump offended her as a woman, she said, and she likes some of what Biden has done, including his support for Israel. Most of all, she said she strongly supports abortion rights and did not realize that President Biden does too. She said that because states' abortion bans had gone into effect during his presidency, she assumed it was because of him. Ultimately, despite her misgivings about the economy, support for abortion rights would probably be what decided her vote. Guys, friends, you and I probably know that, of course, President Biden supports reproductive rights and he's politically pro-choice. But even that apparently is being taken for granted. We can't take that for granted, right? It's so ingrained to us. Like, oh, well, of course, Democrats are the pro-choice party. Not to a lot of people. A lot of people don't realize it because we have this perception that if something good or bad happens on the watch of a particular president, it's because of that president, right? And you and I have talked about this before, that yes, the president is individually the most powerful person by far in this country, if not the world, but he or she is still one person, and there are limits to what he or she can influence. And we have a federalist system in which states have a great deal of discretion and autonomy. It's a federal republic. But the perception is, okay, this happened while Joe Biden was president, ergo he either be the cause of it or he must support it. Folks, I mean, and I've also mentioned this. This is from a blog written by Dan Fifer, who is one of my favorite political commentators, even though he and I disagree, because he's also of the opinion, it seems to me, based on things he said before, that it's hard to try to reframe the narrative, and perhaps you shouldn't when people feel a certain way. But even he's made the observation in the aftermath of that damning New York Times poll that came out a couple of weeks ago. He's like, when he's trying to calm people down, he says, perhaps the simplest explanation of Biden's political challenges is that he's done a lot of good, popular things, and almost no one knows about them. Navigator tested a series of messages about Biden's various accomplishments, including by allowing Medicare to negotiate for lower drug costs and the bipartisan law to rebuild roads and bridges and efforts to create more manufacturing jobs in the United States. Guess what? All of this stuff is super popular, blah, blah, blah. Every accomplishment tested in the poll had the majority support. It's hard to overstate how impressive that is in a deeply divided, highly polarized country at a time when the president's approval ratings are in the low 40s, okay? Here's the bad news. According to the poll, a majority of Americans heard little or nothing about the accomplishments tested. There is a yawning knowledge gap. Again, you and I, even in our own individual way, but certainly Democratic politicians and their surrogates in the media, take nothing for granted. Nothing. You have to have a turnkey, comprehensive, multifaceted messaging operation going 24/7. No breathing room, no time for breaks unless they are strategic and carefully considered. Take nothing for granted. Assume nothing. Keep it out there. I mean, that again, that's part of the reason why the Republican Party has been so relatively successful despite their enormous disadvantages in terms of policy, right? They have a story, and they recognize that if you have to choose between facts and feelings, feelings matter more. They're not mutually exclusive. We have the facts on our side, which should make it, at least in theory, much more easier to persuade people when you have the facts on your side. But facts do not, have never, and will never speak for themselves. So if you and I want to make the case that the Republican Party is the worst option by far on every front, we can't take that for granted, and we have to shout it from the rooftops in so many combinations of words. That's why I spend so much time making the case, very often basically trying to repeat the same argument in just like different nuanced ways. Because, folks, rhetoric and persuasion, if it may fail 9 times out of 10. You may try, I'm sure you've encountered this in your personal lives where you've had arguments or discussions with people, maybe about politics or religion or anything, sports, pop culture, whatever it may be, where you're trying to persuasively make the case to a person. And you may have 10 instances in which you try to make the case, and 9 of them fail. But if you catch someone at the right time, at the right moment, with the right combination of words, you really can change hearts and move mountains. So we have to do that politically, especially as we head into an election year. Let me know what you think in the comments section.